Greetings and welcome back to our channel. The world rarely changes through grand speeches or all-night summits. More often, it shifts course through short, cold, and precise actions, so swift that by the time people realize it, the entire game board has already been tilted. December 11th, 2025 was one of those moments. No sirens, no emergency bulletins, no red headlines scrolling across primetime news, just a single order carried out off the Caribbean coast. A Venezuelan oil tanker seized by the United States. In a normal world, this might be viewed as a legal matter, a maritime dispute, or just another sanction in the long-standing US-Venezuela conflict. But in the world of power, energy, and national survival, it was a gunshot without sound. A bullet aimed straight at the consciousness of every resource-rich nation still comforting itself with the belief that it's safe. Caracas called it piracy, a word heavy with emotion and outrage, but powerless to change reality. Because in closed rooms in Washington, where energy maps are displayed larger than political ones, that act wasn't seen through a moral lens. It was pure logic. In a fractured global order where war no longer requires bombs, those who let energy slip beyond their control will sooner or later pay the price. And here lies the real, unsettling question. Not whether Venezuela is right or wrong, nor how powerful the US truly is. The real question is, where does Canada stand when these rules are enforced with the cold precision of mathematics? Are we merely observers, or are we already in the crosshairs without admitting it? Because that seized vessel wasn't just carrying Venezuelan oil. It carried a hidden message to every nation rich in resources but poor in strategic will. A reminder that resources don't protect their owners. Only power, infrastructure, and political resolve can do that. And Canada, with one of the largest oil reserves on Earth, is not an outsider in this story. We often like to think of ourselves as a peaceful, polite country that respects the rules. But the energy world doesn't run on politeness. It runs on control. In this era, oil is no longer just a commodity. It's leverage, it's pressure. It's the invisible line between a sovereign nation and one being steered by others. That's why the silent gunshot off the Caribbean didn't close the story. It opened a new chapter, where energy is no longer just about gas prices or environmental debates, but about national power. And from that moment on, we're forced to face an uncomfortable truth. Once energy becomes a weapon, every nation that owns it is already at war, whether they admit it or not. There is a very common illusion in this century that war only begins when missiles are launched. But reality shifted long ago. Long before the first shot is fired, war unfolds silently in contracts, in pipelines, in maritime insurance clauses, and in decisions that appear purely economic. Nowhere is this silent war more visible than in the realm of energy. In the 20th century, oil was the reward after war. In the 21st, oil is the reason for war, the tool to prevent war, and the method to force submission without firing a single shot. When a nation controls not only its own energy, but also others, it doesn't need to issue ultimatums. Just by adjusting the flow, the price, the access, it can make an entire opposing economy feel the pressure. Look back over the last 2 decades. Venezuela wasn't strangled by tanks, but by oil sanctions. Iran was dragged to the negotiating table not by falling bombs, but by a chokehold on energy exports. Russia wasn't just punished for war. It was punished because its oil and gas are the lifeblood of Europe. These conflicts wear many political colors, but beneath them all lies the same force: energy. Whoever controls it controls the heartbeat of others. The United States understands this better than anyone. They don't need troops to occupy oil fields. They dominate through financial systems, international law, perfectly timed naval patrols, and the power to shape the market. When an oil tanker is seized off the Caribbean coast, it isn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It's a declaration that oil may only flow when it serves the order Washington deems beneficial. In that world, energy is no longer a simple matter of supply and demand. It is a strategic weapon, far more flexible than bombs. A single sanction can cut deeper than an airstrike. One blocked pipeline can cripple an entire economy for years. And perhaps the most frightening part? It all unfolds under a veneer of legality, order, and due process. That's why resource-rich nations without control over their infrastructure often become the quietest victims. They sell their most valuable assets at bargain prices, while those who control the rules reap far greater rewards. They think they are cooperating, when in reality, they are being locked into a fixed role, the dependent supplier. And so, when we look at the global picture, a question becomes impossible to ignore. If energy has become a weapon, if oil is now a tool of power rather than a neutral commodity, then where do the nations with massive reserves truly stand? Are they the ones holding the weapon, or are they the ones with a weapon pointed at them? At this moment in time, Canada can no longer consider itself an exception. Geology does not care about a nation's peaceful image. Oil reserves do not recognize the label ally. In the eyes of superpowers planning decades ahead, Canada is not just a friendly flag in the north. Canada is a vast energy vault, and every energy vault is carefully noted on lists no nation wants to find itself on. There is a belief deeply rooted in the Canadian psyche, one that has endured for decades, that we are an outsider nation, a peaceful player, non-threatening, safely distanced from the whirlpool of brutal global confrontations. It's a comforting belief, but it only holds true in the textbooks of diplomacy, not on the resource maps of the real world. Geology doesn't care about reputation. Reserves don't care about political stance. And oil certainly doesn't care whether you want to become a target or not. In the rooms where strategic decisions are analyzed, where morality takes a backseat to long-term interests, Canada is not viewed as a gentle nation. Canada is seen as a massive, stable, geographically convenient block of energy, and one that remains largely untapped in terms of power. That combination is exactly what makes Canada unique. Not as noisy as the Middle East, not as unstable as Venezuela, not as openly defiant as Russia, but in possession of something far more valuable: vast reserves of heavy crude, sitting right next to the largest consumer market in the world. The problem is Canada has never truly behaved like a country that understands that position. We talk at length about global responsibility, environmental standards, and constructive roles, but we rarely speak plainly about power, rarely ask the hard question: if one day energy becomes a matter of life and death, who will decide the fate of Canada's oil? Ottawa or some other capital? Jokes about Canada being the 51st state are often brushed off as harmless diplomatic humor. But in the language of strategy, jokes often reflect truths too uncomfortable to say outright. This isn't about borders or symbolic sovereignty, it's about control over resources. A nation can keep its flag, its anthem, but if it cannot control how its resources are moved, priced, and used, then that sovereignty exists only on paper. For years, Canada has cast itself in the role of a reliable but passive supplier. We sell oil, but don't control its path. We extract resources, but let others determine their strategic value. And most dangerously, we've confused being called an ally with being guaranteed long-term national interest. In a world where energy is a weapon, there is no such thing as complete neutrality. Every resource-rich country is categorized, assessed, and quietly placed onto lists the public never sees. Lists of adversaries, lists of alternatives, and yes, lists of friendly nations that must be managed. Canada, though no one says it out loud, has long belonged to that last group. And that's precisely why the most dangerous moments don't arrive in the form of major crises. They come disguised as small administrative decisions, a signature, an executive order, a project shelved without debate. That's when it becomes clear that real control doesn't lie in the oil fields, but in the infrastructure that gets the oil to the world. For Canada, that moment already has a name. It didn't arrive with gunfire or diplomatic uproar. It came quietly on a morning in the new year, and it was called Keystone XL. There are moments in history that arrive without noise or fire, but their consequences last for decades. Keystone XL was one such moment. On January 20th, 2021, with a single signature, the pipeline project, once seen as the future backbone of Canada's oil sands, was officially terminated. There were no tense negotiations, no strategic compromises, no meaningful compensation for the long-term losses Canada would endure. It ended so quickly that many didn't even grasp what had just happened. On the surface, the reasons sounded familiar: the environment, climate change, green commitments, words that felt righteous, timely, and nearly impossible to argue with on moral grounds. But this is where strategic naivete began to show. Because if the environment were truly a red line, why was the United States at the same time working tirelessly to bring Venezuelan heavy crude back to the market under its own control? Why were refineries along the Gulf of Mexico still optimized for oil with chemical properties nearly identical to Alberta's bitumen? The uncomfortable truth is that Keystone XL wasn't canceled because it was dirtier. It was canceled because it threatened to shift the balance of power. Once completed, the pipeline would have given Canada a stable, large-scale export route, significantly reducing reliance on current infrastructure bottlenecks. Canadian oil would no longer be trapped in a single corridor. It would be harder to underprice, and most importantly, it would no longer be fully at the mercy of others to dictate its flow. In strategic logic, that's undesirable. A Canada with more options is a Canada that's harder to control. A Canada with stronger infrastructure is a Canada with a louder voice. And in the world of energy, sovereignty doesn't come from what lies underground, but from the ability to bring it to market on your own terms. So Keystone XL wasn't just a canceled project. It was a costly lesson in the difference between public reasoning and real motivation. Canada accepted that decision as an irreversible fact, barely questioning its long-term strategic consequences. We comforted ourselves with the idea that the market would self-correct, that other transport routes would compensate, that alliances would ensure shared interests. But markets don't self-correct for those stuck with weak infrastructure, and allies don't share power unless they're forced to. The consequences of the Keystone moment didn't arrive overnight. They came slowly, quietly, month by month, year by year. Oil is still being extracted, revenues still flow, but real value is eroding. Every time Canadian oil enters the market, it carries an invisible label, stranded supply. And in the world of commodities, stranded means discounted. This is where another kind of war begins. No bombs, no public sanctions, just numbers on a pricing board, repeated so often they become background noise, accepted as natural law. But this isn't a law of nature. It's the direct result of losing control over infrastructure. And when that pricing gap becomes normalized, the wealth of an entire nation starts to bleed away, bit by bit, under the illusion of a free market. There's a kind of war that requires no front lines, no named enemy, and no official declaration. It happens every single day, on pricing boards, in numbers so small they seem harmless. But those very numbers, repeated long enough, can quietly drain the strength of an entire nation. This is the war of price differentials. Western Canadian Select has always sold for less than WTI, so many have grown used to this gap, treating it like a law of physics, as if Canadian oil was born inherently less valuable than American oil. But oil has no nationality. Hydrocarbon molecules don't recognize borders. That gap doesn't exist because of quality, it exists because of power, because of who controls the infrastructure, who controls the exits, and who holds the power of substitution. When Keystone XL was canceled, and when alternative transport routes continued to face delays and limitations, Canadian oil entered the market with a fatal weakness. No strong way out, and the market has no mercy for the weak. A trapped supply is always underpriced. No need for secret deals, no need for overt conspiracy. All it takes is for buyers to know the seller has no alternatives. Every dollar of difference between WCS and WTI isn't just an accounting loss. It's a hospital that wasn't built, a school with a slashed budget, an infrastructure project postponed, a retirement fund quietly eroded. But because these losses don't strike all at once, because they don't cause immediate shock, they're rarely seen as a crisis. They become the new normal. The most dangerous part of the price differential war is this. It doesn't provoke outrage. It breeds familiarity. People grow used to Canadian oil being cheaper. Used to a national budget tied to forces it doesn't control. Used to explaining everything away as market forces, while ignoring that the market itself has been shaped by infrastructure and geopolitical power. And then, as the US starts bringing Venezuelan oil back onto the market under its control, the game grows even colder. It's no longer just about supply competition. It's about diluting the strategic value of Canadian oil. With a new source of heavy crude now within Washington's sphere of influence, Canada's leverage weakens. No need for direct pressure. Just give buyers more choices and let Canada slide quietly into a weaker position. The war of price differentials doesn't need a dramatic victory. It just needs time. enough persistence to make a resource-rich nation with little control get used to accepting less than its true worth. And as that wealth is drained bit by bit, so too is the nation's political resistance. An economy squeezed long enough becomes cautious, conflict-averse, and more willing to accept limits imposed by others. But price differentials are only half the picture. To sustain that pressure, more than market mechanics are required. There must be barriers cloaked in moral language on one end and hard power on the other. When one side speaks of the environment, while the other quietly ensures security through naval force, the vice begins to close. And Canada, trapped by infrastructure and squeezed by pricing, slowly realizes it's not just facing a market, but standing inside a carefully engineered geopolitical structure. One thing that sets the 21st century apart from previous eras of confrontation is this. Power no longer comes solely from weaponry, but from the ability to make others limit themselves. And no tools are more effective in doing so than two seemingly opposing forces, environmental morality and military strength. When both are activated simultaneously, they create a pincer grip that few nations can escape unless they actively change their position. At one end of the grip, Canada faces increasingly strict environmental standards. On paper, it's progress, it's responsibility to the planet, it's the morally correct choice. But in geopolitical reality, standards only become power when they are applied evenly, and that's where the asymmetry lies. Canadian energy projects are scrutinized to the smallest detail, delayed or indefinitely shelved due to protracted legal procedures. Meanwhile, alternative oil sources, just as dirty, often less transparent, are still allowed to flow freely if they fall within the right strategic orbit. On the other end of the pincer lies hard power. Naval forces protect transport routes. Patrols ensure energy flows move in the right direction. Interventions happen without declarations of war, but clearly remind everyone who guarantees security for the system. When Venezuelan oil returns to the market under tight control, it's not just an economic decision. It's a clear sign that military power is quietly paving the way for strategic choices. When these two forces work in tandem, the result is a highly sophisticated structure. On one side, Canada is trapped behind moral barriers, hesitant to expand infrastructure for fear of appearing out of step with the times. On the other, competing oil sources, despite comparable emissions, are protected and prioritized under the banner of security. Canada isn't under attack. Canada is placed in a position where no good options remain. In this trap, the economy begins to shift into a defensive posture. Major decisions are delayed. Strategic projects are watered down, fragmented, or abandoned. A resource-rich country begins to act like a risk-averse one, not because it lacks capability, but because it fears stepping outside the framework imposed upon it. The most dangerous aspect of this pincer isn't the immediate damage. It's the long-term psychological impact. When a nation becomes accustomed to being blocked at every turn, it starts to self-censor its ambitions. It convinces itself that restraint is rational. It believes that standing still is a form of safety. But in the energy world, standing still means letting others decide for you. And so the real question is no longer whether Canada should keep debating the environment versus the economy. The question is, can we escape this strategic trap by changing our perspective, by shifting our axis entirely? Because if the North-South corridor has become locked down by both moral and military constraints, there remains only one direction where the grip has not yet fully closed. A direction that doesn't just lead to new markets, but offers a path to redefining Canada's energy sovereignty. That direction lies to the west, where the Pacific Ocean is more than just water. It may be the last remaining exit from an ever-tightening vice. When all familiar paths are under someone else's control, a nation's instinct for survival will inevitably push it to find a new direction. For Canada, that direction isn't an ideological choice, it's a geographic one. If the north-south axis has become a corridor locked by infrastructure, politics, and the interests of others, then the east-west axis leading to the Pacific is no longer just an alternative. It becomes the only viable escape route. The Pacific is not just a vast ocean. It is the epicenter of energy growth in the 21st century. Asia lacks neither money, nor demand, nor the ambition for long-term energy security. What it lacks is a stable supply. coming from a trustworthy, transparent country that's not entangled in spirals of conflict. On paper, Canada fits that profile perfectly. But in practice, we've never truly entered that arena as an independent player. Pivoting toward the Pacific isn't just about building another pipeline or export terminal. It's a declaration that Canada refuses to be defined by a single direction. When oil can flow in multiple directions, bargaining power is restored. When there are more buyers, no single one can squeeze prices by exploiting infrastructure bottlenecks. And when choice returns, the term ally becomes more balanced, less one-sided. But a pivot is never easy. It requires vision that extends beyond election cycles. It demands patience in the face of public pressure. And most of all, it calls for political courage to admit that the old path is no longer safe. Every year of hesitation is another year Canada shrinks its own strategic space, while the world around us shifts at a relentless pace. The Pacific, if approached correctly, doesn't just open access to new markets. It opens the door to a new role for Canada in the global energy system. No longer just a passive supplier, no longer the last link in a value chain controlled by others, but a nation capable of connecting resources with technology, standards, and political stability. However, exporting crude to the Pacific only solves half the problem. If Canada continues to sell bitumen while others refine it, attach the value, and reap the power, then true control remains out of reach. Strategic freedom doesn't come from simply redirecting the flow. It comes from changing the nature of what flows. And that's where the conversation shifts, from geography and infrastructure to something deeper. Refining capacity, technological investment, and the ability to transform crude oil into a product with higher political, moral, and strategic value, something that could rightly be called freedom fuel. There is a paradox that has persisted for decades in how Canada treats its own resources. We extract some of the most difficult oil in the world only to sell it in raw form and then buy back refined products at a higher price. That's not just an economically inefficient choice, it's a strategic failure, disguised under the label of market efficiency. In the modern energy world, power doesn't belong to the one with the most oil. It belongs to the one who controls the final layer of value. Refining isn't a secondary step. It's where crude becomes political influence. It's where a nameless barrel of bitumen is transformed into jet fuel, marine diesel, or strategic products for military and industrial use. Any nation that skips this step willingly places itself outside the power equation. Yet Canada has everything it needs to avoid that fate. Our oil sands extraction technology is among the most advanced in the world. Our environmental standards, often seen as burdens, are in fact a rare strategic advantage. Add to that a highly skilled workforce, a transparent legal system, and access to long-term capital, and we have all the ingredients to build a modern, cleaner, and globally competitive refining sector. The issue is that we've never told this story through the lens of power. Instead of viewing refining as a pillar of national security, we've treated it as a short-term profit calculation. Instead of treating emissions-reducing technology as a strategic lever, we've written it off as a cost to bear. And by undervaluing ourselves, we've handed others the right to set our value. Freedom fuel isn't a romantic slogan. It's a deeply practical concept. It's fuel produced in a transparent system, untainted by conflict, free from geopolitical manipulation, and meeting increasingly rigorous environmental standards. In a world where many oil sources are tied to instability, sanctions, and war, such fuel carries value far beyond simple market price. If Canada refines more, masters more of the technology, we don't just sell energy, we sell stability, we sell predictability. We offer an alternative to nations seeking to avoid risky dependencies. At that point, every barrel of fuel carries not just energy, but national credibility and diplomatic leverage. The tragedy is that this path has always been delayed by fear. Fear of large investment, fear of political debate, fear of backlash for going against the current of popular slogans. But in the real world, no country ever achieved strategic autonomy by avoiding all risk. Only those willing to invest in their future retain the power of choice. In the end, freedom fuel isn't just about oil. It's about whether Canada is willing to break free from the role of cheap gas station for others, whether we're ready to rise to a higher rung in the value chain where resources are transformed into real power. And the moment we answer that question will determine whether Canada stands as an independent energy fortress or remains just another replaceable link in a game where the rules are always written by someone else. When we step back and look at the full picture, from the seized tanker off the Caribbean coast to the pipelines quietly halted without debate, a truth begins to shine more clearly than any slogan. Resources never defend their owners on their own. Oil, whether buried deep underground or flowing through steel arteries, only truly belongs to a nation if that nation has both the will and the capacity to control its fate. December 11th wasn't just the day Venezuela lost a ship. It was the day the world was reminded that ownership in the energy era is always conditional. Canada now stands at a crossroads, one that history will not allow us to delay forever. On one side lies the familiar path. Keep extracting, keep selling at a discount, keep comforting ourselves with the notion that we are a reliable partner in a system built by someone else. That road won't lead to immediate collapse, but to a slow weakening where every major decision is made from a defensive posture and every missed strategic opportunity is justified by caution. The other road is harder, demanding long-term vision and political courage. It means acting like a nation that understands its own strength, building infrastructure not just to export but to negotiate, investing in refining not just for profit but for leverage, setting high environmental standards not to tie our hands but to turn morality into strategic advantage. This path does not promise perfect calm, but it offers Canada the most precious thing in an uncertain world: the power to choose. The line between a fortress and a gas station doesn't lie in how much oil is in the ground or in the daily market price. It lies in political will and in how a country sees itself. A gas station exists to serve the flow of others. A fortress exists to protect its own space of survival and only opens its gates when it serves its interests. History rarely remembers the polite nations, the ones who played nice and avoided conflict at all costs. History remembers those who knew when to compromise and when to stand firm. In an era where energy has become a weapon, neutrality is no longer a safe position. It is the most easily manipulated one. So the final question isn't what the United States will do next or how global markets will fluctuate. The question is, who will Canada choose to become in this story? A vocal energy fortress or a silent gas station on the sidelines of power? If you have thoughts on the path Canada should take, share them in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this discussion valuable. And if you'd like to continue exploring the stories of power, energy, and geopolitics hidden behind the headlines, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next.